Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the honourable people who are the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on. I'd also like to acknowledge the important role that custodians play in maintaining country and culture, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. GHD is delighted to be able to support the 2024 State of the Territory Address through CEDA. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of our GHD team and our Canberra Region Manager, Lucy Havanek. Welcome. I'm sure it'll be an informative event, and it's a great opportunity to hear from the Chief Minister. So it is an important event in the ACT calendar and provides valuable insight into the state of the economy in the ACT, and an important chance to hear from the Chief Minister on the ACT Government's vision and priorities for the ACT. This is particularly relevant as we head into an election later this year. So in that respect, it is with great pleasure that I'm able to introduce the Chief Minister, Mr Andrew Barr, as our keynote speaker today, and Professor Jane Golly, member of the New South Wales ACT Advisory Council at CEDA, as our facilitator today. In terms of format, the Chief Minister will first provide his presentation, we'll have lunch, and then Jane will lead us through the facilitated Q&A session. So please think through your questions and get ready to ask them after lunch. So I had the honour and sometimes pleasure, Chief Minister, of being the ACT Chief Engineer over the last 5 years. Yeah. There are moments of stress in all our roles, Andrew. As I reflected on my time with the ACT Government, I realised that the great thing about my job was that it was solely focused on making the place I live, Canberra, the best place it could be. The Chief Minister hardwired this focus through the development of the ACT Wellbeing Framework, which provides a comprehensive approach that measures what is important to Canberrans and contributes to our quality of life, and then this then becomes a key guide for decision making through the budget process. The focus on wellbeing provides a timely reminder that infrastructure is fundamental to supporting our quality of life. Without the services that good infrastructure enables, our wellbeing plummets dramatically. And I think Chief Minister Talkback certainly reinforces that link on occasion. GHD is a proudly Australian professional services firm with a vision of making energy, water and communities sustainable for generations to come. We work across a variety of sectors, including water, energy, environment, property and buildings and transportation, with a core skill set that covers engineering and construction, architecture, environment, advisory and digital. We have a proud and long history in Canberra and have been involved in many projects and much of what makes Canberra great. And as one of the largest professional services firms in Canberra in the infrastructure sector, we're involved in a variety of local initiatives across a broad range of sectors, and I thought I might just highlight 2 or 3. This includes current work such as being the engineer designer on Light Rail Stage 2A, which is very exciting, providing project management services for healthy waterways, which many of us know and love, to support or to clean up our waterways. And also we provided some foundational advice to government on the energy transition, sort of covering economics and engineering, which I think supported the recent decision on the future of our gas network. So we look forward to continuing to support Canberra to be the best place it can be and to remain one of the world's most livable cities. And with that, I'd like to welcome the Chief Minister, Andrew Barr, to the stage. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much, Adrian, for that very kind introduction, and thank you, Simon, too, and to CEDA for allowing me this opportunity to present to you all today. The broad theme of my remarks will be the experience in the territory economy over the past decade and what that experience will mean for the coming 10 years. But before I begin, I too acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we gather, the Ngunnawal people, pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families here in the Canberra region. At the beginning of any State of the Territory speech, I think it's obligatory to state the state of the Territory economy. So let me begin by saying the Territory economy is strong and we have a very positive outlook ahead. The reason I'm confident in making that prediction for the future is our experience over the last 10 years. In the decade that concluded at the end of fiscal year 22-23, the ACT led Australia in economic growth. Our real gross state product had grown by 3% per annum through that decade, in comparison with the Australian average of 2.4%. So very significantly above national average performance. And as you can see from the June quarter of 2015, the ACT has been the only jurisdiction where annual state final demand has shown continuous growth. Now, on a per capita basis, our SFD continues to improve, and I think this is important. A lot of the story of Australia's economic growth has principally been one of population-driven economic growth, but when you strip back the data and look at per capita measurements, Australia hasn't fared quite as well as the ACT, where our real GSP per capita and our SFD per capita have been increasing. So it's not just population growth, although that has been very strong, that has been driving our economic performance. The outcomes that we've achieved over this decade have obviously been against the backdrop of the same sorts of national and global challenges, a pandemic, obviously some international instability in a couple of very significant regions around the world, and at a domestic level, interventions quite dramatic by the Reserve Bank to reduce inflation. Now, during the pandemic period, it was a period where the economy locally, nationally and globally was clearly propped up by some very significant counter-cyclical investments by all levels of government. I can observe that was largely successful, and here in the ACT we did not go into recession during the COVID pandemic, meaning that we can claim now, believe it's 33 years of continuous economic growth. No other state or territory in Australia has experienced that, and I would be surprised if there were any subnational regions anywhere in the world that could claim 33 years of continuous economic growth. Now, what we have seen in the post-pandemic recovery period is both the federal budget and a couple of the very resource-rich states have seen a significant rebound in their cash positions, principally driven by the iron ore price. But for the rest of us, the majority of the Australian states and territories, our fiscal challenges have not been helped significantly by mining or resource booms. And so we suffer from a challenge of diminished capacity to raise revenue, but at the same time, very fast growing populations. I'll expand on this point a little later in my presentation. That said, the fiscal position for the Territory does continue to improve out of COVID, and a number of these are well documented external shocks. But the Territory economy, in large part thanks to elevated levels of public consumption and investment, has indeed rebounded very strongly. Another significant factor contributing to the resilience of our Territory economy has been household consumption. But we have, of course, seen the increasing cost of living pressures, particularly on mortgage-paying households, as the gears of monetary policy are slowly turning. For those of us with mortgages, feeling like they're just crushing us just a little more than we would perhaps like at this point in time. And this is something that we are certainly actively monitoring ahead of both the Commonwealth budget in May and our own in June. But look, across the most recent completed fiscal year, the Territory's real GSP growth was 4.3%. That is a remarkably strong performance. State final demand rose by 3.5%, driven by these important contributing factors: household consumption, public consumption, and public investment. And the other factor that has undoubtedly supported the Territory's very strong economic growth has been our nation-leading rate of population growth. Why does this matter? I think it's a pretty important measure, an indicator of success for a city or a region, particularly in any nation where there are very low barriers to internal movement. So in the simplest form, this shows people voting with their feet, choosing where they want to live, work or study. And we are experiencing really strong attraction to Canberra, but also retention. And I think that's probably the difference that's led to our above Australian average level of population growth, has been our capacity to retain talented people here. People are staying, they're building careers in increasingly diverse industry sectors. They're building businesses, they're here with their family, often now multiple generations. One of the benefits of the city being 111 now is that really for the first time we have multiple generations living here. People, when they retire, don't go back to where they came from, they're staying in Canberra. Let me say, I don't mind cashed up superannuants retiring and spending money in our economy. That's a great thing. That is underpinning a lot of that household consumption, particularly for the rest of us who have mortgages or are renting, who perhaps don't have as much disposable cash at the moment. That economic contribution from our retirees, superannuants, has been really important to keeping our economy moving. Now, we've experienced the highest population growth across the Australian states and territories in the decade up to June 2023, growing at around 2% per annum. The Australian growth rate during that period was 1.4% per annum. Now, this is manageable level of population increase, but it does bring challenges. Adrian touched upon wellbeing as a key priority for us, and how we go about measuring improvement in wellbeing and ensuring that as our population increases, that we are investing in the infrastructure that supports that, and that increased population leading to more social diversity and more economic diversity leads to a better city for people to live in. I think these are good challenges to have, though. I would much rather have this challenge of rapid population growth than the counter, which a couple of Australian states, don't want to single out Tasmania and South Australia particularly, but they have traditionally had challenges both attracting and retaining young people. That is not a problem for Canberra. And I think that sets us up for a really promising decade ahead. What it does mean, though, is there is elevated demand for housing. And we've been particularly focused in recent times, and will be, to continue to expand the number of dwellings in the Territory. Now, we've almost reached 200,000 dwellings in Canberra now. The census data showed 2.5 people on average per dwelling. That tells us that our population is honing in on the 500,000 mark and will continue to grow beyond that. If we're adding about 10,000 new people a year, 2.5 per dwelling, that gives you a sense of the increase in housing supply that we're going to need each and every year. That's why we signed up to the National Housing Accord, and why we intend over the next 5 years to deliver more than our population share under these National Housing Accord targets. We do so because we think it's important to improve housing choice, access and affordability. Now, that can mean making some challenging decisions about where new housing can and will be located. And it does mean some change in some parts of suburban Canberra. But I think there is an appetite for that, and in particular areas where, if you like, the sort of suburban development model that was established in the 50s and 60s with a local shopping centre sort of nestled in the middle of a fairly low density suburbia. Some of the economic trends and challenges have started to make some of those local shopping centres not viable with the existing population bases in each of those suburbs. So I think the planning changes that we brought in last year present an opportunity for renewal in a number of these suburbs that will support the renewal of what is often the heart of a Canberra suburb, and that is its local shopping centre. And so we will certainly be looking to some further reforms there to encourage that change. We want more people living in our CBD, but we will also need new suburbs. So the approach to meeting that housing supply needs to be multifaceted. It can't just be about infill, nor can it just be about new suburbs. It needs to be the totality of our city footprint, some new areas, and a particular focus on new housing associated with employment centres and transport corridors, which has really been the direction of public policy and planning policy in the Territory for 2 decades now. The other factor that is very significant in driving that economic and population growth is the size and diversity of our labour market. Now, it remains one of the strongest in the country. Employment grew by about 25%, a little over 25% in the decade between January 2014 and January 2024. So average growth of around 2.3% per annum. To put some raw numbers on this, about 54,000 new jobs created, taking the total at the moment, it bounces around from month to month, but to around 270,000 jobs in our Territory economy. We have very high participation rates here in the ACT, so it's fair to summarise Canberra as a working city. Our participation rate is significantly higher than the national average, and I think higher than all other jurisdictions, except occasionally we slip into second place behind the NT. But I think it gives you a sense of how much of a productive and working city this is. Our latest job vacancies data showed about 8,500 vacant jobs in the Territory, about 30% more than the pre-pandemic levels. And for a considerable period of time, we had more job vacancies than we had unemployed people. So even if we were able to get sort of the perfect match of skills for those people who are unemployed with the available positions, we still would have had vacant jobs. Now, some of the Reserve Bank's work has tightened the labour market a little. Those conditions are easing somewhat. The number of job vacancies sort of relative to people unemployed is now more at equilibrium than it has been recently. But our unemployment rate still often has a 3 in front of it. Economists will speculate about what exactly is full employment. And this is a question I often ask a room full of economists, and will get, unsurprisingly, 100 different answers to that question. But I think by any objective measure, we have been at full employment, and we probably remain there at this point in time. So my sense is the strength of our labour market will continue to be a driver for more population growth. The other thing that's changed is the composition of our workforce. So back in December 2011, nearly 31% of the workforce were employed by the Australian Public Service. Fast forward 10 years to the end of December 21, that share had reduced to just a little over 24%. So private sector jobs have grown by nearly a third in the 10-year period between November 2014 and November 23. The public sector also grew during that period, but by about half that rate at 17.5%. So in summary, we have an increasingly diverse dynamic and growing labour market. Noting, of course, that the federal government clearly is the main employer and its presence in our economy is a very significant factor in underpinning 33 years of economic growth and providing a great deal of stability and counter-cyclical support when our economy needs it. And I think it's important to recognise that. That is obviously the reason the city exists. But you can look at that in two ways. Either that Canberra will always just be a Commonwealth public sector town, or, and this is my view, this is a tremendous economic base on which to build an increasingly diverse territory economy. That's the approach we've taken over the last decade and the approach that we would intend to continue with. I want to highlight two significant growth industries over the past decade that embody the increased diversification and our territories well above national average performance in service exports. These two sectors are education and tourism, both of which obviously significantly impacted through the COVID period, but have rebounded incredibly strongly and will be significant long-term contributors to our employment diversity and our economic growth. Now, travel exports, which include business and personal travel in the ACT, grew from about 780 million in 2012-13 to 1.3 billion in 22-23, a decade-long growth of 65%. Most of this came from inbound tourism, which grew from 736 million to 1.26 billion, a 71% growth rate over that decade. But I want to particularly acknowledge our biggest export industry, our billion-dollar export industry, international education. As an economic contributor, unparalleled, but I think as a social and cultural contributor, also very significant for Canberra. Our international students provide significant impetus to our population growth. Student arrivals have increased 166% over the decade. That is very considerable. Each year, Canberra's tertiary institutions enrol over 60,000 students. The majority of these are from interstate or overseas. There are students from 8 states and territories, but over 100 countries studying in Canberra. A sector making a tremendous contribution to our city, and I am very optimistic with the new Universities Accord, a federal government that is engaging deeply with the sector, and a real sense that the war on universities that felt like was being played out simply for sort of cultural, political points over the past decade, that's ended. Our universities are front and centre of Australian and ACT government policy thinking, economic development, social and cultural development, skills and opportunity, and really are the mainstay for us. One of the reasons that higher education is one of my favourite portfolios. One I've kept through most of my career. To complete the sweep of our GSP drivers, productivity, labour market, population growth, I just wanted to briefly touch on what all of this means for households, looking at their earning capacity, their relative income strength. Having such a highly skilled workforce means that our median weekly household income is considerably higher than the rest of the nation. The gap about 36% higher as measured in the 2021 census, and significant growth over the past 10 years. I've painted this picture of what the last 10 years, what's occurred, what's gone well for us. There's always a few challenges, but I want to spend the second half of my remarks looking at what all of this means for the public policy settings we will need over the coming decade. In the simplest of terms, the growth in population means we need to invest in infrastructure now. Adrian touched on some of the reasons for that in his introduction. It's critical if we wish to maintain our world-leading living standards, if we wish to boost the capacity of our economy and to improve the well-being of our community. The alternative policy approach is really just to sort of wind back our infrastructure program, do nothing for 10 years. That would mean delaying projects that are needed and worsening intergenerational outcomes. Infrastructure matters. It really matters. It's why we talk about it so much in the public domain, why nearly everyone has a view, and why we shouldn't lose sight of the importance of talking about it. What we build matters. Where we build it matters. And when we build it matters. It all fundamentally impacts housing affordability, economic opportunity, well-being, and social outcomes. Now, over the past decade, we have been busy delivering a long list of projects, big and small, that are shaping the Canberra we're living in now. In this election year, you'll forgive me for making this observation, that in contrast to the government that came before us, this government builds hospitals and community health facilities. We have opened the Centenary Hospital for Women and Children ahead of the centenary in 2013. The University of Canberra Public Hospital opened in 2018. We will open the Canberra Hospital expansion later this year. And immediately after that, work commences in earnest on the new Northside Hospital, with construction to commence later this decade. We have delivered stage 1 of light rail. Many people said that would never happen, as well as our Law Courts precinct. We demonstrated by procuring those projects as public-private partnerships our willingness to appropriately risk share with the private sector in the delivery of important public infrastructure. We've invested in our road network, Majura Parkway, Gungahlin Drive, Horse Park Drive, Gundaroo Drive, Cotter Road, all supporting expanded land release, more housing, and ensuring as best we can that Canberra remains the 15-minute city that we all love. It's one of our principal advantages, that most Canberrans don't spend several hours a day commuting to and from work, study, or other activities. That's critical to defend and protect, and it means investment in transport infrastructure. We've been actively in the business of delivering new and refurbished public housing on a per capita basis, more so than any other state or territory. Over the next 5 years, our budgeted infrastructure investment program includes further significant investments in public transport and road infrastructure, the electrification of the Territory's bus fleet, the extension of the light rail network, investment in education and skills infrastructure, including delivering a new CIT campus in Woden that opens next year, investment in physical health infrastructure that I've talked about, but also in digital health, and a nation-leading program of response to climate change. A national award-winning sustainable household scheme supporting Canberra households to electrify, to make that transition, to reduce their cost of living and their emissions, and to support the development of a sector that is clearly going to be a key part of Australia's transition. And often we've done so in a policy environment at a federal level that has not been supportive at all. And there were certain times over the last 10 years where the ACT government, and particularly our renewable electricity procurement, was the only show in the nation, the only place making this transition. And it was, I think, a significant achievement for the Territory to achieve 100% of our electricity annualised through contracted renewable sources, and to do that in 2020. We also recognise that as our city grows, we need to invest further in community and event infrastructure. Wouldn't be a discussion on infrastructure in this city without things like convention centres and live music venues and theatres and stadiums being part of that discussion, and they are part of our forward infrastructure plan. But in recent times, we have prioritised health and housing infrastructure. I know that is often a contested thing, and I go back to the observation that nearly everyone has a view on infrastructure. But we have been clear in the last 4 years in particular that expanding Canberra Hospital and investing in our public and social housing were higher priorities. But we are now turning our minds to what the next 5 to 10 years will look like. Our population growth requires infrastructure, but it has to be well planned, it has to be phased, and it has to be linked to demand and need. And then looking beyond the next 4 or 5 years, we have outlined in some detail the longer term priorities. There is a very long list of infrastructure that will need to be built as Canberra grows. I just make the observation that for obvious reasons, it can't all be delivered in 1 year. It can't all be delivered even in one parliamentary term, but it will need to be delivered over time. And so the challenge as the Territory's Treasurer is how will we finance this? The answer is a combination of our operating cash surpluses, seeking Commonwealth co-contributions towards projects, and that means being nimble and understanding the history of Commonwealth contributions and the types of infrastructure assets they are willing to make contributions towards. It also means prudent asset sales, which in the Territory's case is largely the land endowment that we were granted upon self-government in 1989. There are still quite a lot of undeveloped blocks that are in appropriate areas to support housing, mixed use, commercial, industrial, hotel, a range of different uses. We still have quite a lot of land. We will be bringing that to the market in a more aggressive way over the next 5 years to support the population growth, but also to provide a partial financial offset to some of these important infrastructure needs. The final area, of course, is borrowings. We do borrow for our infrastructure program. I think that is an appropriate intergenerational response for assets that have lifespans of half a century or more. This brings me back to the point I referenced earlier about the fiscal capacity of state and territory governments. Now, we all of us, all 8 states and territories retain excellent access to capital markets. We're all highly rated entities. Some a little more highly than others, but there is no denying, looking across each state and territory budget, an increasing reliance on debt to fund new infrastructure. It is a reasonable economic decision to make, but not without its controversy. In my view, given our population growth over the last decade and what we are forecasting over the next, this is a once-in-a-generation time where our infrastructure demands are as high as I can perceive them needing to be. A combination of that rapid population growth plus the ageing infrastructure that we inherited upon self-government. One of the joys of being 111 is you have some bits of infrastructure that are 111 years old and need some renewal. And so we face a dual task of needing to build new, but also to replace some of that ageing infrastructure. Just an interesting statistic that I thought I would share. In 2021, the federal government borrowed twice as much as all of the state and territory governments combined. Looking at 2024, semi-government debt, so state and territory government debt, borrowings from sub-national governments, is expected to be double that of the Commonwealth in this coming calendar year. This inversion is reflective of two things: a growing vertical fiscal imbalance and these rising infrastructure demands that are necessitating a state and territory response. Hands up who is not familiar with vertical fiscal imbalance. A few, okay. What it means, in short, it's the term given to the disparity between the spending responsibilities of state and territory governments that they have to fund and the services that we are constitutionally required to provide, weighed against the narrow and diminishing revenue base that we have, and contrasting that with the Commonwealth's ability to raise considerably more revenue than the states and territories against their considerably reduced expenditure requirements. Now, part of vertical fiscal imbalance is addressed by national partnerships, by the Commonwealth providing the states and territories with funding for hospitals and schools and housing. These are often multi-year agreements and highly contested. We're about to go through another round of them. Those who follow the Federation closely would have recognised that the National Cabinet in December last year made some pretty significant decisions about the National Disability Insurance Scheme, about health funding, and about the GST distribution. These are all critical elements of vertical fiscal imbalance. But the problem, which really originated when the states gave up income taxing powers to the Commonwealth at the Second World War, continues to get worse, not better. And the GST has not fixed the problem. And so we continue at a subnational government level to be facing expenditure demands that are growing faster than our revenue base, and a very narrow range of taxes that we can levy, and a couple of High Court decisions over one very recently and a couple of others over the last few decades have further narrowed the state and territory revenue raising capacity. So this is a real issue. It is perhaps firmly in the dull but worthy discussion points for economists, but it's real and the problem grows. Our challenge here in the ACT is that when compared to some of the other jurisdictions, our revenue base is even narrower. I pointed out the Commonwealth share of employment. The Commonwealth exempts themselves from state and territory taxes. So fully 1/4 of our labour market is exempt from one of our largest revenue sources, which is payroll tax. It's difficult. We have a very narrow range of taxes that we can lean upon. This is why we have pursued tax reform. Within that limited range of taxes, we have endeavoured, and we started this more than a decade ago, to increase the certainty around our own source revenue by focusing on our municipal broad-based land taxes whilst seeking to phase out transaction taxes like stamp duties, and 7 or 8 years ago now, we fully abolished duties on insurance. I think the federal government can help the states and territories by working more closely with us on tax reform, but also on infrastructure. And I have to say, I greatly welcome the measured and reasonable approach of the Federal Infrastructure Minister, Catherine King, and the new federal government, and the approach they have brought to national infrastructure partnerships. Contributions from the federal government towards our state and territory infrastructure needs are absolutely essential. We won't be able to deliver the infrastructure program we need without their support. So I have to say I am pleased that the Prime Minister lives in our city now, and is more attuned to some of our local issues, and that the current federal government is prepared to invest in the national capital. The framework for this, the National Capital Investment Framework, the Prime Minister and I announced in July last year. And since that announcement, we've already seen significant Commonwealth co-investment, including a further $125 million towards the next stage of light rail. We have a 50-50 funding partnership here. This will enable us to move forward in extending the network. Confident that provided we do the work and put forward good propositions, that the Commonwealth will be there as a funding partner. We look forward to jointly funding further initiatives, and I am very grateful that we're able to have such an open dialogue with the Commonwealth. The partnership is absolutely essential to securing the infrastructure our city needs. In concluding my remarks, and just moving a little beyond infrastructure, this year the National Cabinet will be having some pretty significant discussions on federation reform that are going to shape the provision of a number of critical services for our community over the coming decade. The Housing Accord, system-wide structural health reform, so reinvesting in primary healthcare, reforming the disability ecosystem, addressing future skills challenges, and implementing the recommendations from the Australian Universities Accord. Each of these will improve the well-being of our residents, Australians, and I think have the capacity to significantly increase productivity, participation, and economic outcomes for the ACT. It's going to be a very busy period. All of this will shape how Canberra looks in 10 years' time. And if I'm fortunate enough to be re-elected in October, I look forward to playing my part in that next decade of economic growth for Canberra. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much to the Chief Minister for his very thought-provoking talk. I'm sure you all have lots of questions today, and that's what the rest of the time is dedicated to. I'm apparently allowed to use my chair's privilege of asking a couple of questions, but I am going to immediately ask you that if you do have a question you'd like to ask, could you please, a microphone will magically appear at your hand. If you could, stand up if you feel like it, or otherwise stay seated, but please let us know your name and where you come from or where you work. And we would really appreciate it if they were questions, not lectures. You can make them a little bit tricky if you like, but of course always with respect to our, I'm going to say, wonderful Chief Minister. I did this last year. I think I've done it a couple of times now, and I hear Andrew's talk and just feel a beautiful kind of glow of being a proud Canberran, as I know he is. Lots of positive aspects to walk away with. We seem to be the best at just about everything in the country, and you know, for those of you who have come to live from outside the city and made this your home, I hope you also get to share that sense of pride that I hear when I listen to you outline both what's happened in the past and where it's going into the future. So casually I'm going to start looking around to see if anyone puts their hand up, but I guess I also wanted to kick off as I want to do, with a question about migration. So I think that you present a really compelling argument in favour of migration, but I've always thought that way. I'm a big Canberra population believer. I have been for a very long time. I love hearing that we're going to crack the 500,000 mark, and personally I don't mind looking out to a future with a full million either. But I know that I'm not all Canberrans, and I think it's, well, bound to become a political issue both within the city but more broadly at the federal level, and I guess globally. There is pushback against immigration, and the basic story goes that immigration, you know, migrants come in and they take our jobs and they take our houses, and they increasingly might also, you know, create some crime in the city as the standard or that sort of federal narrative goes. And I think it's very easy for people to tap into that fear. Your starting point is enough to sell me. It's a pretty simple story, and that is migrants raise per capita demand. That means they're probably raising per capita output as well, and that's not a natural expectation by economists. In fact, it can go either way. but that's your starting point for selling it. How else do you plan to win people over into this idea that Canberra can and should be a city of 500,000 people in the not too distant future, right? It's a couple of years away according to your own forecasts.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. It's going to be a feature clearly of the next 12 months in Australian politics. This debate will mostly play out at the national level as it pertains to the national migration program, and perhaps to a lesser extent in the university sector, the sort of extent of the international student intake and what the future years might hold there. I'm confident in this community that there is a very strong embrace of new citizens, and that Canberra's history has been one of steady, not over the top population growth, and the people who've lived here for a period of time sort of reflect upon what their experience in Canberra was 10, 15, 20 years ago. And most people, not everyone, but most people reach the conclusion that actually this is a much better place to live in now than it was a decade or 2 decades ago. I arrived here as a 4-year-old in 1977, so like most people in Canberra, came from somewhere else. Increasingly, there are people, a greater share of our population was born here and have been here their entire lives, but still most Canberrans are new, that they've arrived themselves. Now, the sort of the irony of someone who's migrated here saying, well, I'm here, no one else can come now, that certainly has not stopped people running on those sorts of political platforms. And I think we saw an example of that in a federal by-election where the coalition candidate was of Irish heritage and was getting up there in a very strong Irish accent saying, no more migrants, basically. Now, fortunately, he didn't win, and I don't think there's a big political constituency in Canberra for an anti-immigration, anti-population growth sort of political platform. But I am also conscious that a lot of this is about managing change, and that the pace of change can sometimes alarm people. And so I think that it's sort of incumbent on government and on our social and cultural institutions, some of whom are obviously big beneficiaries of increased population growth, to be part of the positive narrative around why this is good. But look, I reflect upon the people I went to school with and university with, sort of graduating in the 1990s, how few felt they could stay in Canberra because there wasn't the economic, social and cultural opportunities or experiences that they wanted. And how different it feels now for people graduating out of our school system and our higher education system. I mean, yeah, sure, there will still be some people for whom their career or personal interests will take them to a larger Australian city or overseas, but increasingly Canberra, because of that increased population, social and cultural diversity and economic opportunity, offers what people want. And that helps us. I think that is part of the narrative, that, and whether it is, I think the things that are most commonly said to me, and this will tell you a lot about some of the friendship networks and cohorts that the 30, 40 and now early or 50-year-old hangs out with, but a lot of people say to me how much more impressed they are that Canberra finally has, bars and nightclubs and venues that are much better than they were, that the restaurant scene, the hospitality scene has lifted, to an extent that used to be only 1 or 2 places anyone would ever want to, would say this is an Australian leading restaurant. Now we've got 24 of them, and that's sort of universally recognised, that the student experience, is ranked in the top 25 in the world in terms of student cities. Wasn't necessarily always the case. that our events, our activities, our sort of things that glue the community together are so much more diverse and on a grander scale than they ever were. That the increased population means you can get a flight to more places, including internationally in a way that you hadn't been able to previously. The retail shopping experience is way better than it was 20 or 30 years ago. So you can sort of point to a lot of, I guess, consumables, for want of a better description, that sort of highlight the reality of how much better Canberra is now than what it used to be. I mean, I'm old enough to remember the shops closing at midday on Saturday, and there's mad rush for everyone to get everything done in 3 hours on Saturday morning, and then there was bugger all else happening over the rest of the weekend. Like, that is not the city that we live and experience now. And I think a lot of that is, I mean, there's a bit of regulatory reform there, obviously, but a lot of that is also due to the increased population, the diversity of our community. So I think there's sort of a retail end to selling it. Then there is a clear economic benefit. And then we also, I think, will rely a lot on the fact that this city is very highly educated, and that we've got people from more than 150 different countries, and that people's friends and neighbours have come from overseas or interstate. So Canberra is a meeting place. It has a purpose, and I think we're on the right path here. But I am always conscious that if it happens way quicker than the majority want, then people will call it out a little, and that is largely growing pains, and that's what we need to be alert to.
Yeah, and that's exactly what you'll need to manage, and including the environmental impacts as well, which is another quarter of,
indeed,
or not
and that,
part of the
and that
society
is
that
often,
could push back on it.
if you like, the left of centre argument against population growth. There's a sort of
They're coming at you from all directions.
Indeed, yeah.
And just
What's that Steelers Wheels song? Stuck in the middle, clowns to the left of me, jokers to the right. That sort of, like, sometimes politics in the ACT can feel a little like that. Yeah.
And just to pull rank, I was a migrant here at the age of 3 months, coming from Adelaide via Canada, so in 1971. Just a little bit before you. There's a question up the back there.
Anthony Willis from Maddox Lawyers. Thank you for your very informative remarks, Chief Minister. Always interesting. I might just comment in passing. I had coffee with a friend on the terrace of a cafe this morning, and we were just commenting on the fact that we both remembered when Gus's first had to fight the battle to allow people to have coffee on the terrace of a cafe in this town. So we have come a fair way since then. But my question, and I think it's a segue from what you've just been talking about, you referred intriguingly in your remarks to moving on from infrastructure investment to investment in cultural and sporting facilities. And I'm very interested to know if you can give us any insights into the thoughts as to those cultural and sporting facilities that might be in mind for the next decade of investment.
Yes, yeah. So we did... Back in 2019, we put out a 10-year forward infrastructure plan that was holistic in effectively every infrastructure asset class. What we've been doing over the last 12 months is updating particular sections of that plan. One of those key updates was in entertainment, arts and sport, and that encompassed, amongst other things, probably the big 3 or 4 pieces of social infrastructure that would rank in the top 10 most talked about infrastructure projects in the territory. So that includes convention centre, theatre, live music venue and stadiums, sporting stadiums. So there is a pathway outlined, some indicative costs associated with those projects, and in our mid-year budget update, which I released last month, we provided some further funding to progress a number of those projects. The one that is sort of closest to an investment decision to fund construction is the new Canberra Lyric Theatre as part of the theatre precinct. The concept there being to add a facility with around 2,000 seats and a contemporary staging infrastructure that would enable most of the major performances that tour the east coast of Australia to also tour Canberra. At the moment, our theatre that was the best in Australia in 1968 is now no longer the best in Australia. And so this project would bring us sort of back up into that tier one live lyric theatre context. It's a project that's in the sort of fiscal realm of several $100 million as opposed to $1 billion, which some of the other ones I think have the capacity to stretch towards in the current infrastructure market. So that's what I think, to give a sense of what's coming next, the next big investment decision in the arts entertainment space is that Lyric Theatre.
Sorry, I think there was another hand up back there, but maybe it'll come up again. I'll look out for it. Thank you.
Thanks this morning, Chief Minister. That's been a really amazing presentation. Look, I'm really interested in the long-term sustainability of all of these assets that we're going to be investing in, and particularly tracking towards the 2030 and 2045 targets. We've sort of pulled our target back 5 years than many of the other states. I'd like to really congratulate you on the getting off gas policy in Canberra. It's, you know, really excellent in terms of our carbon footprint. ACT has been really progressive, particularly in the electrification space. I guess, though, that is only part of the picture. And so what I'm really interested in is when we'll look to embodied carbon in the ACT and how we'll integrate that into the business case framework so that those investments are really long-term sustainable and pick up the other half of the pie.
Yeah. No, look, a good point to observe. Obviously, there are, I think, considerable improvements in both material reuse and new construction materials that are, I think, well, certainly lower emission, if not in some instances zero emission. And so we are conscious of some of the, I guess, the more detailed technical elements of either the design brief or the materials or constructability that we put out to market for public projects. There's I guess an interesting mix here between the regulatory framework and so where the territory might sit in comparison to the other states and territories in relation to the building code, for example. Weighing up against that is our scale, which can sometimes be useful in being able to pilot a new construction technique or methodology or materials in a way that can make an infrastructure project either significantly less carbon intensive or in some instances even get to a net zero position for that particular project. Part of the challenge, though, at the other end of the scale can be simply the reality that unless Australia or some of the bigger international players move, there is no alternative currently available. Now, technology will continue to advance, and I'm aware of a number of companies, including some Canberra-based ones, that are looking at technology around capturing embedded carbon and doing better in that context, and there's clearly going to be global demand for that. We are often faced, though, with a dilemma around effectively needing to choose the least worst outcome in terms of the totality of emissions associated with a new project. So I can confidently say that the starting point isn't just knock over everything old and build something new, and that there is a lot of work put into recycling or adaptive reuse of particular materials, but that just at the moment doesn't work for every single new project. But at least it is assessed and we have an understanding when we commit to build something new that both its, I guess, its emissions associated with construction and then its operating sort of lifespan, all of that is taken into account. And we have made decisions that I think have cost more up front, but lead to both lower operating costs and lower emissions over the asset's life. And I can point to commercial buildings, health and education infrastructure, transport infrastructure that would reflect that approach. So I would say we do better than most, but I'm not going to sit here and say that, oh, we've solved all of these issues. And everything that we do is a net zero when it comes to construction of anything new, where we're not quite at that point yet, though. But aspiration clearly is there over the coming decades.
Greg Barr from CDC. Chief Minister, your emphasis today on the population growth further sort of focuses us all on the disparity of representation at a federal level of our jurisdiction relative to other jurisdictions. There has been some talk at federal level around territory rights reform. Where do you think that's up to, and where do you think that will go?
The Self-Government Act is nearly right. It's needed a few changes. Obviously, the most significant one in recent times was the removal of the insertion from the former federal MP Kevin Andrews around not allowing the territories to legislate on end-of-life issues. Before that, though, the Gillard government addressed a couple of the most anti-democratic elements of our constitution, effectively, that allowed a single federal minister to advise the Governor-General to veto any territory law. So that was removed by the Gillard government about a decade ago. It's an interesting question of sort of checks and balances in a unicameral system. We don't have a House of Review and Upper House, but of course our territory parliament is elected by proportional representation. So the history, of the political and the parliamentary outcomes in the territory has really, with one 4-year exception, no one party has ever had a majority. So sort of the ability of the executive government to run roughshod over the legislature and to has never been there. There's always been a number of checks and balances, and the Self-Government Act still provides either the House of Reps or the Senate by a vote of all members and a majority of members to be able to still intervene in territory matters, but it's a much higher threshold really to get to that point, and to erase a territory law, you'd need the House and the Senate to agree. So that would sort of imply in the current political environment in Australia a degree of bipartisan agreement that something the territory had done was so egregious that the federal parliament had to intervene. So I feel that framework is much better than it was a decade ago. I think the territories are still, what we've seen in the voice referendum, we only count towards the national vote. We're not considered equivalent to states in that sense. And I mean, the ACT's economy is already 25% bigger than Tasmania's. Our population will become bigger than Tasmania's, I think, in my lifetime. So this sort of historical quirk of were you an original state or not, I think will ultimately need to be addressed. And then, clearly what's been topical in recent times is the fact that on a per capita basis, I believe Tasmania, South Australia and Western Australia have more senators per capita than the ACT does. So it's not just that it's a comparison between the ACT and Tasmania, it's our population has grown so much that there's sort of a relativity question with the SA and WA as well now. We're probably a long way off that being an issue with Queensland, Victoria and New South Wales, but for more than half the states now, they have more political representation via their House and Senate members than we do. The irony of Canberra being considered the politician's haven is that we actually have fewer politicians per capita than I think any other state or territory, because the combined local government, state government role of the Assembly, and then only 2 senators and only 3 members of the House.
Lisa Paul from the University of Canberra. Thank you, Chief Minister, for a great speech. Really clear and helpful, and wonderful to hear it in person here. Thank you. My question is about your view about how we continue to reduce social inequalities. So as Canberrans' average income goes up, all our people on statutory incomes stay where they are. And if you're homeless and have mental health issues and drug and alcohol and so on, it can be a really hard and lonely place to be. So I'm interested in your views about how we continue to invest in our ecosystem of support and so on for the people who are most disadvantaged in the territory.
Yeah. It's an excellent point. Some of our statistical averages and medians can hide or perhaps gloss over some significant pockets of disadvantage. I think the interesting thing for the economic statisticians is I understand the Gini coefficient, which is the measure of relative income inequality. Canberra is the most equal of all of the Australian cities, but that in large part I think reflects the fact that we don't have the extremes of wealth that some of the other cities have, but equally that we do also have a quite strong social security support. From a territory government level, we have imperfect information and imperfect delivery mechanisms to make significant wealth transfers within our sort of revenue and concessions system. But we do our best with the information that we have available to us. But in large part, we have to tie a lot of our eligibility for particular concessions and programs to a Commonwealth payment or threshold. I would say probably the biggest challenge we have is that there's a cohort of Canberrans who sit just above all of those statutory supports, who then fall on the wrong side of eligibility for a range of concessions and discounts, but for whom there isn't a mechanism for the territory government to sort of directly deliver assistance. We're working with the Commonwealth, and last year's energy rebates program was a good example of where, through information the Commonwealth could provide to energy providers, we were able to extend a range of rebates to family tax beneficiaries in categories A and B. I'm getting the nod there. It was both. Because previously, sort of our concession threshold was, did you have a concession card, a healthcare concession card, or something from the Commonwealth that indicated low income. But once your income was sort of $1 above that, you'd miss out altogether. We were able to extend those energy rebates sort of up the income scale a little. I'm not one to want to buck past too much, but principally, obviously, income support is a Commonwealth responsibility. And particularly since they took over income taxing powers in the Second World War, they have more levers available to them. I would say I was obviously pleased with the way the Stage 3 tax cuts were reshaped, and there are 4 electorates in Australia that sort of benefited the most from that, and 3 of them are in the ACT because we have a very high pay-as-you-earn, and we have a lot of people who were in that income band from 45,000 to 120. And so they sit above the statutory income support levels, but obviously we're feeling a lot of the cost of living pressures. So that's helped. From our perspective, I guess our next biggest thing that we can do is be the main provider of housing or the main supporter of community housing. And so that's been a focus for us. That tends to be, if you can have a secure home, that tends to be the basis in which you can build a range of other social supports, support people to obtain the skills that they need to enter the labour market, and we certainly have enough jobs at the moment, and so if we can provide that support and stability, then that is, I think, a meaningful thing we can do to assist people out of homelessness. The mental health issues and challenges are, again, a shared responsibility between the levels of government. If I had the answer to this, I would have implemented it 10 years ago. I don't, but we are sort of endeavouring to work with everyone who, brings new ideas and a sort of an open heart to addressing some of these issues. And I think we're making some progress, but again, I can't sit here and say we've solved everything. We haven't. And sometimes our affluence is a big contributing factor to mental health and social isolation issues. It's not just a question of people's incomes.
I just realised I hadn't even looked over there, but we do have time for only one more question, I think. So. Unless it's a short one with a very short answer.
With a short answer, that's true. That would.
We'll see how you go.
Yes, I'm a politician.
Lorne Cummings from the Canberra Business School, University of Canberra, Chief Minister. One question I was going to ask you is about the recent Universities Accord and how that might apply here in the ACT, given that one of the recommendations is a greater alignment between higher education and vocational education, and we have a number of institutions here in the ACT. What are your thoughts on that in the sort of the near-term period?
In short, I think there's a lot of scope for increased collaboration between our major public TAFE provider, the Cambridge of Technology, and the university sector, UC, but not just UC, I think. And I know there's a good and open dialogue occurring. My mind goes back to a decade ago when I was the schools minister and the vocational education and training minister. We were undertaking some of the qualification reforms, in the Australian qualifications framework. There was a degree of challenge, if I couldn't put it diplomatically, around how that you might provide students with an opportunity to undertake a dual sector either course of study or particular sets of qualifications. I'm not sure that we've necessarily advanced that too much over the last 10 years, but I suspect there is some hope and goodwill in this process. Partly that comes down to available resources and then a question and a pretty level-headed assessment of what our local and what the Australian skills needs are going to be. And increasingly, I think there's an opportunity in applied technology in areas that relate to ICT, and the impending AI revolution. That you can certainly see the face of work and the nature of work changing, the skills needed changing, and I think clearly both the vocational education and training sector and the university sector are going to need to adapt and work together to support the community in that transition. I guess the challenge for government is to find the resources to make that transition happen quickly.
Well, thank you all very much for those thoughtful questions covering a broad range of things, and also for your deep and thoughtful answers, Chief Minister. It is now time for me to call the proceedings to a close. I'd like to thank GHD again for their sponsorship of the event. And on behalf of CEDA, thank you all for coming to listen to Chief Minister Andrew Barr. And thank you, Andrew, for giving us your time today. Good luck in the year ahead. You've got plenty of work to do in your two jobs, Chief Minister and Treasurer. Please join me in thanking Chief Minister Barr.